All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thank you to the Florida Native Plant Society for allowing me to present. This is actually a work in progress, but I'm just trying to get ideas and hear questions and develop this more. But this is a research project uh, to study the plants at North Woodlawn Cemetery, which is an African American cemetery in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Right. Um, so Woodlawn Cemetery is about a 4 acre cemetery. So it's actually quite small compared to so many other cemeteries. But Woodlawn is special because this was the only burial space in Fort Lauderdale for African Americans prior to 1962. Another thing that makes it interesting is that when it did start in a woods area, and that's actually what the local community did call this area where the cemetery was. Um, so the community called it the woods, and the cemetery was actually on the edge of the city of Fort Lauderdale when it started, and now it's kind of surrounded and been urbanized. So one of the things that I wanted to do is when I first started working at Woodlawn, I did this with students. This our kind of service learning project grew from the work that the Florida Department of Transportation and Janus archaeological consultants were doing to mitigate the expansion or some ideas that they wanted to do to expand I-95 further. And one of the things that did happen in the 1970s is when I-95 was built, they did uh, build over parts of the cemetery. So the Potter's Field was built over, and archaeological evidence, they did ground penetrating radar in 2015, and they did find disturbances that might have indicated the presence of human remains. And back in April of this year, an archaeologist was supervising some repair work for a light fixture near 95, and they did find a bone in that area that was believed to be the Potter's Field. So it kind of confirmed some of that. So there's work in progress now to kind of recognize that and to, tell that story a little more within Woodlawn Cemetery. So Woodlawn Cemetery is located off of Sunrise Boulevard and I-95. So if you take the I-95 exit, if you're going northbound and you're going, exit east, Woodlawn would be south of that intersection, just for anyone who might know South Florida. All right. And I don't want to do that yet. Oops. Before I get into the plant symbolism, what I want to do is kind of, when we started this project, I went out there and the kids were really interested in telling stories. We wanted to tell the stories of the people. And so the project was not so much a let's collect the flora or do something about the plants. It was we wanted to collect information from headstones and document the people who were buried at the cemetery in case something happened. And that was back in 2014. And so since then, I have taken students from both Boyd Anderson High School and Plantation High School out to this cemetery to do work. And, every time that I would go out there, I'm like, man, I wonder what tree this is. I wonder what tree that is. And man, if I knew this, I could probably map this. And so I ended up in the summer of 2018, I enrolled in an Associates of Science program at Broward College. And I learned GIS. I got a GIS certification, and I've taken a lot of environmental science courses that have allowed me to understand the science aspect that I couldn't understand as an anthropologist and historian. So a lot of that background has helped. And so this project is part of essentially like my capstone for the associate's program, and it's ongoing. It will probably expand to other cemeteries. I really like this. There's so many questions, and I'll share with you some of like the ideas that I have and some of the connections that I believe exist as we kind of go through the presentation. So one of the things that I did want to talk about a little bit is in mortuary affairs or in cemetery studies, there's a lot of symbolism. We have angels and we have lambs, and there are a lot of symbols that have to do with plants and have to do with flowers, and a lot of the flora is involved in some of the symbolism that we see at cemeteries. And so, that's part of what I wanted to discuss briefly. I'm not going to spend too much time because there's a lot of symbols, but I did want to highlight a few. So, it's funny, this should be the last slide. The daisies, when you see daisies planted, or sometimes you might see daisies represented on tombstones, they represent children. And the other symbol for a child is usually a lamb. Down here in South Florida, I've usually only seen lambs or like little cherubs for children. Ferns represent humility, and fig trees represent one of the species that are associated as or considered the tree of knowledge. And this comes from the story in the book of Genesis about Adam and Eve. And because it is considered the tree of knowledge, it's also a fertility symbol. But like I said, there's a couple of trees that have this tree of knowledge moniker. All right, cypress is one of the other trees of life. And this is actually one of the photographs from the project. You can see on the top that I do have like the latitude and longitude, and in some pictures you'll see the letterboard that kind of indicates. But there were a lot of cypress trees in the cemetery in different spots. So one of the big questions is, who planted these? Were these planted by the community? Were these, obviously they're not native. So how were they planted? Is each cypress tree a representation of a marker of one person? Or was it just a decorative thing that they decided to put in this area? Some of the questions I may not be able to answer with every single tree. But it's still something that we want to document because there's very limited documentation. No one has done a study of the trees inside of cemeteries like this before in South Florida. Now, I got the idea from some European scholars who actually went into cemeteries and looked for native plants in their respective countries. And they found that the majority of native plants, like they ended up being native plant sanctuaries. But, Woodlawn is only 100 years old. Some of these European countries have, hundreds of years of history. So might be some of the differences, but we still want to find out. So that's what we do. Lilies represent renewal and resurrection. This is another one of the, this was found at Woodlawn Cemetery. It's the only one that was out there. So this tree has an interesting story as well. This is a sausage fruit tree. You can see the sausage fruit hanging from the tree. It's also known as Kigelia africanus or Kigelia pinnata, depending on which reference you're looking at. They use both, but it is the only tree in the Kigelia family. Genus, excuse me. So it's interesting that we have a tree that has an origin, an African origin. This plant is predominantly found on the continent of Africa, and it is used to treat various illnesses. The fruit, the sausage fruit itself, is treated and processed to make beer. So there's a lot of different uses of this particular plant. And so it's interesting to find a plant with an African origin in an African American cemetery. I read somewhere several years ago that sausage fruit trees are always found in African American cemeteries. And that got me really excited. I'm like, cool, we got one. And then I went to 2 other African American cemeteries in Broward, and they did not have a sausage fruit tree. So this is definitely introduced by someone in the community. it'd be cool to do some DNA analysis and see, if we could find the parent tree. Maybe it's another tree that's in South Florida somewhere, maybe at Fairchild's Tropical Gardens. Somebody could have gone there and taken seed from there. The herbarium, the University of South Florida Herbarium does have samples of Kigelia from Fairchild. So that's kind of where I got that idea from. Like, maybe people visit that all the time. So, I just kind of wanted to get a little bit closer and give you some better views of this plant, of this tree. So here you see the sausage fruit tree. All right. A little bit close up of the bark of the tree. Now, obviously, this is not native to South Florida. It's not very common, but it's interesting to find an African origin tree in a black cemetery. And then one of the things that I found interesting is that the Kigelia, as it grows, has started taking over this tombstone. And this isn't the first example of the tree growing and kind of overcoming a marker. When I first started at the cemetery, we did have another tree that was doing that at another marker, but the city has taken care of that. All right, so of course, you walk around and everybody knows this bane of our existence, so the Melaleuca. So we did have a couple of Melaleuca. There's a close-up. We also have the strangler fig, or a fig. Not quite sure if it's strangler or not. I'm still working on the ficus identification. But we can see it wrapping up. So I was really excited when I saw the fig wrapping around the Melaleuca. I was like, yeah, go natives. So I forget the species name of this. I think it's like Dracana something. I forget the subspecies right now. But the reason that I kind of included this is because this is a well-known landscape plant. And I was told by someone that it was very, very popular in the 1950s as a landscape plant. And it's the only one that's out at the cemetery. And it has also an origin from Africa. This species of plant is found on Madagascar, and it's native to Madagascar. So interesting. Maybe it was just there accidentally. Maybe it was just pretty. Again, we don't know how this plant got here and why they selected this plant, but we can't discount the connection. Got to acknowledge the connection at least. All right, so now I'm going to delve a little bit into some of the historic plants, which was like the real focus of this project. To do this, and really the reason I have this pine tree, and this is one of the 3 pine trees that's at Woodlawn Cemetery, I went to another black cemetery in Pompano back in February. I was doing a quick survey of the cemetery up there, and I noticed, there were native plants. So there was gumbo limbo tree. I was like, okay, cool. It looked to me to be relatively young. And then I kind of looked around and there were other evergreens. And then I saw a lone pine that was about similar in size as the one that we're looking at here. And it got me to thinking, like, okay, so we have a pine here. I know there's pines at Woodlawn. I wonder why the pines are here. And so I started delving into kind of like photographs when the contemporary, I guess the sister cemetery for Woodlawn would be Evergreen Cemetery, which is the white cemetery in Fort Lauderdale. And when Evergreen started, some of the historic photographs that I found, you see in the background pine trees. And so that they, it started off kind of like in a similar style, like a community developed cemetery. And so, I had to, okay, is this native? Is this old? Is this original to this, or was it grown? And so that's part of why I kind of, the pines are important. And so this would be Pinus eliade, and I believe the subspecies is densa, which is the Dade County pine, which is funny in itself because we're in Broward, but I don't want to get all too historical for a sec. All right, here's one of the other pines at the cemetery. And the third. All right. So then the question becomes, well, how can we tell if these pine trees are native to Fort Lauderdale? And so again, I looked at historic photographs, and then I remembered that we have a collection of aerial photographs. And so I started looking at the aerial photographs. So here is a photograph of Woodlawn Cemetery. You can see it right in the center. You can see it's delineated almost in a rectangle in the middle. And so we can see through this photograph that there are trees, in the cemetery. So the question is, are these the same trees? Based on, a easy observation, we can see, okay, they might easily be these two plants over here appear to be the pines, two of the pines that are at Woodlawn now, only they're much larger. The other pine would be situated around here. So one of the things that I'm trying to work on is to get the aerial photographs and put them into ArcGIS, and then kind of use the GPS data to kind of pinpoint exactly and see if I can definitively say, yes, this is the tree that we see in the photograph. I'm still learning and working with ArcGIS, but this is one of the photographs. And I'm going to come back to this in a couple of minutes because there's something else happening in this photograph. But here we can see, this is from 1958. And again, we're seeing more movement. You're seeing tree growth in the cemetery. And then I'm going to go to a 1965. So this is a 1965 photograph. And the reason it's such, at a larger scale, the other one's kind of really focused on Woodlawn, but I wanted to see, I'm like, okay, was it a pineland as it's been described? And so looking at this photograph, we can see all over that it's a pineland. And so we have these pine trees. And interestingly enough, most of these pines that we see in this photograph are no longer there. On this end, we have I-95. So a lot of those pines were destroyed, but there's pines over here in the left-hand corner. And those pines are they're still alive in Fort Lauderdale. If you drive west on Sunrise Boulevard, you can still see them. And I'm going to go out and document those as well, just because now I know I've got to document them. But even within the community, I asked a family that I'll talk about shortly about the pine trees. I said, man, there's so many pine trees all over the place. And some people have these 3-4 large pine trees in their yards. And you can't help but wonder, I'm like, wow, like, did they really like the pine trees? And so they said, no, it was just a really good shade tree. And if they had the ability to build around the tree instead of taking down the tree, then they would build around the tree. So there are, throughout this Black community, because Fort Lauderdale was segregated, you see in the community, in the homes, that there's large pine trees everywhere. So it still reflects that pineland environment. And even, I guess the love or the appreciation that the community had of the plants, and now it's interesting to me. One of the things that I did read was that in Fort Lauderdale, one of the cemeteries, and this would be Fort Lauderdale Memorial Cemetery, when they started building it in the late 1940s, one of the things that they did was that they grubbed it. They cut down all the trees and they removed all the roots, and then they wanted a barren landscape so they can rebuild the cemetery. And so in the in the study that I found, it actually said, oh, there was a lot more palmetto and pine than we expected, and so they had to spend more money. It even gives a breakdown of how much they paid to grub the land for that other cemetery. But it seems that with both evergreen and woodlawn, the community kind of just built the cemetery first and wasn't as concerned with, okay, we're going to lay it out pretty and make it manicured and all that. And woodlawn still has these characteristics of this kind of community cemetery versus the other three cemeteries in Fort Lauderdale that have more of a municipal, well managed landscape. All right, so this is one of the ficus species. I'm going to delve into this plant shortly. It's one of my this is one of my favorite stories. All right, so this picture that you see here is of the interview that students from Boyd Anderson High School did in 2014 and 2015. There were multiple interviews with this family. And what we started doing was we would share our stories in the African American newspaper, and we would ask people like, hey, do you have anyone that's buried at Woodlawn Cemetery? Would you be interested in talking to us and sharing your story? And so this family reached out to us and they said, well, come talk to you. And so this is one of the photographs from that day. And so this family has been really pivotal in uncovering something that's only been mentioned in literature about cemetery studies, and in particular when it comes to African connections to African American burial practices. So we're looking at the relationship between African Americans and Africans and how they're connected. And so the Bellamy family came out, and their first interview was in early December 2014. And so they spoke to us, and we learned a lot about the racism that existed in Fort Lauderdale. Mamie, the woman in purple, she told us about licenses that African Americans had to get in order to be able to work and to be permitted to work on the other side of the tracks or in the white parts of town, either before sunrise or after sunset. And so, you know, the kids were really interested, and we got interesting stories. And they also shared with us the story of their father, Donnie Bellamy, who was a patriarch. Was one of the first, he was the first member of their family to come and settle in Fort Lauderdale. He was a sharecropper. And so we learned about the Bellamy family through this oral history process. Following our interview in early December, we had planned a field trip to go back to the cemetery. And so we asked the Bellamys, would you guys join us and show us where your family members are buried so we can, document it and see. And so you see, we've got Jeffrey, the student in the red shirt, is documenting. And so we have the family members there kind of explaining stuff to us. And so one of the things that we came to find out on this day, and we weren't recording anything per se, like with audio, it wasn't an oral history interview. So we were just out there talking, and this croton is a marker for Donnie Bellamy Jr., which would be the brother of the ladies that you saw in this photograph and the cousin of the gentleman that you saw in the photograph, Mr. Stroman. And so this was a marker for one of the family members. Now, this tree, this croton, is no longer there. The city of Fort Lauderdale had a change of management with the cemetery. And so during that transition, one of the things that I saw disappear with one of my frequent field trips out there was the croton was cut down. And so it's bothered me. So I know the place where it is, and I want to go ahead and put it back or put another one there because it would be appropriate, but I still need to get the blessing of the property owner, which is the city of Fort Lauderdale. But we have an example there of a common African burial practice, which is planting trees as the marker for a family member. And so Donnie Bellamy Jr. was the oldest son. And so that's why he got a tree put there. But I found out later that actually what had happened was the tree, the croton here, was not put in until decades after. And it was actually Mamie, the woman in purple, that actually she loved crotons and she had lots of them at her home. And so she went out one day and she planted it for her brother. Okay. Now, here's the ficus that I had earlier. And then here we can see like the larger view of it. This is a large tree. Now, this ficus is a marker for Donnie Bellamy Sr., the pioneer that settled in Fort Lauderdale and established his family. And this story, the story of how this plant got put in place, also kind of connects the Afro-Atlantic heritage. When Donnie Bellamy Sr. died in 1947, he was interred at Woodlawn. And within a month or two of his passing, his wife went out and planted the tree. And years later, one of the daughters, Miss Ethel Wiggins, picture of the lady in green, Miss Wiggins, asked her mother, like, why did you do that? And the mother's response was, that's just what we do in the family. It's a family tradition. And so that is kind of reminiscent of the African practice for burial, for absolute sure, because in some cases, the practices of using trees could be at a family level, and in some cases, it could be at a tribe level. And so in this case, we have that family connection. So we can say, whoever, or at least we can theorize that the person that came to, or the African that was taken and enslaved and brought to the United States, still carried that cultural practice with them. And even though the family became Christian and does not subscribe to African religion, the practice itself remained. Very similar to what some people might recall from the Kizzy and Kambi Balongo and some of those kind of like connections, cultural connections that we saw in the 1970s Roots, and we even see in the 2015 version of Roots, that some things remained because it was valued by the family. And so this is one of those practices that was valued. And so then the question is, well, are you sure that this is the right plant? Oh, and again, I go back to the aerial photographs. So I'm going to go back here. All right, this is 1947. And approximately here, all right, is where the ficus would be today. Okay. And this is a photograph 10 years later, and we see the plant now, some plant in the space where the ficus is. And then this one from the 60s, we still have the plant. Where is it? I think this is it. I have to double check. That's why the GIS tagging would be ideal, because then we can pinpoint it and be definitive. But we see the growth into the late 1980s. I didn't put all of the aerial photographs up, but we see the plant grow when you go through the sequence of, of time. with these aerial photographs. So it's really interesting, and I'm really excited at the possibility that we can track its growth, the luxury of a 100-year-old cemetery and having the technology that coincides with it. So that's part of this story, and again, an African connection to the cemetery. Now, one of the other things that is common with African tradition is that in sacred spaces like a cemetery or any area that African culture or an African family might designate as being sacred to them, depending on region, there are offerings and sacrifices that might be made or done on these sacred grounds. And there's very specific rules governing how and what happens in some of these sacred places. And one of the things that kind of connects the Bellamy family with African religion today is the connections to the Afro-Caribbean religions like Santeria, specifically Santeria. And I know that because I've met a practitioner at the cemetery. And so that's kind of how I know. But we see within the Bellamy ficus, you've got a candle. So there's your sacrifice, got a magic 8-ball, some kind of ram's horn, all sorts of like material objects that are kind of left here. Now, I don't remove anything from the cemetery. It's one of those things where this is someone's religion, and although it looks like litter, I also am aware that what's litter to me is meaningful and has symbolic importance. And so I leave it as it is because I do recognize it as a religious practice. The city does come through and clear it out on their own, but I have the luxury of being able to say, I'm going to respect the the spirituality and the symbolism of what's there. And then why take it away from another guest or take it away from the person that put it there? Maybe they revisit and maybe they come and take all the objects back once they've, met their purpose or whatever. All right. So here's a wider view of some of these objects. These are from April 20th, 2014. And it's interesting because these photographs that I'm sharing with you, I didn't take these. I gave a camera to one of my students. I said, just go around and take pictures of everything and anything you want. And he took these photographs. And at the time, I knew that it was Santeria related, but I never, aside from the Afro-Caribbean connection, it wasn't until about a year ago that I really thought, well, wait a minute, how about the burial practices in Africa? And so I had the blessing of having the photographs to go back to, and that's how we have them now. All right, there's the another. You got the magic 8-ball on that one. All right, so at this point, I'm done with the bulk of the presentation. So if you guys have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, so not too many questions so far.
Okay.
Usually there's a little bit of question lag. Your most recent question, though, Bonnie asks, what does the 8-ball symbolize?
I don't know. I don't know what the magic 8-ball represents. That's a good question, and I guess one that I need to ask. And that's one of those where I would love to be able to ask the practitioner, watch them if they actually did do or engaged in the practice. But usually when we find things like this at cemeteries or in any place, it's done, secretly, and people don't really like to acknowledge. There's also a lot of fear and misunderstanding with the Afro-Caribbean religions. So I don't know, maybe it's a toy. In Afro-Caribbean belief, there is a deity that is connected to the Roman Catholic saint, or actually the Christ child image. And so offerings for that Christ child, it's actually Elegua is the name of the deity. And the offering for Elegua are toys and things of that effect. So maybe the Magic 8 Ball could be connected that way, but I'm not sure if there's something more. It could be the colors, and the colors could be representative of another deity. I guess I've never really considered that question. So thank you, Bonnie. I appreciate it.
Olivia asks, were there any other religions that were represented at this cemetery? Any specific African religions?
No, not specific African religions. You know, we do have Christian burials at Woodlawn Cemetery, and we know that because the community is predominantly Christian, and oral history has told us that they had Christian burials. There are some military markers that have Stars of David, so we suspect that there might be some Jewish people that were buried here as well. And what happened in 1962 is the cemeteries were desegregated in Fort Lauderdale, and so Woodlawn continued to exist and was a very low-cost burial ground. And so it's possible that after 1962, other groups and other people kind of came in to be buried. But I can't say, aside from the symbols that we see on the grave markers, I cannot attribute any other like African religion or aside from Christianity and Judaism because of symbols on markers. I don't know of any others at this time.
Bonnie asks, what does the glass symbolize and what's in it? So she's referring to the glass candle.
So it basically, the glass is just the container for the wax. The container is probably about 8 inches, and it's full mostly to the top with candle wax, and it's got a wick on it. If you go to the grocery store and you go down the aisle that has like cleansers and cleaners, you'll see like these huge jars of candles, and so it's probably it is one of those. And so it's just the burning of the candle is a sacrifice. It's an offering that's made to the spirits in that way.
So Richard Brownscombe, who is the past president of Broward chapter of FNPS, chimed in with some pretty useful information. He says that there are 1940 aerials online at Broward County's GIS system,
right,
which is a few years older than the aerials that you showed, if you heard correctly. But they may be too low resolution to add any historical information regarding the cemetery.
Yep.
Richard, do you know if those were like coastal aerials that were flown for oil exploration, or were they flown for, do you know why those were flown? I have never looked at those.
Yeah, it's one of the things I'm trying to answer myself is what's the origin of these and why were they done? So
those aerials that you're using, are they from the UF digital collections?
Those are from the Broward County collection.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just I only picked like the ones that were relevant to the Bellamy timeline.
Okay. Richard says that they were military, flown for military purposes.
Okay.
Yeah, because sometimes you can get like 1920s and 30s aerials on different parts of the coast that they were doing explorations, which I guess I'll be covering in my, there's some discussion about doing a historical ecology, do-it-yourself lunch and learn. So I'll be scheduling that probably late October if people are interested. And we can discuss, data sources and how to get all this discussion about data sources then.
Awesome.
Let's see. Ooh, Shakiva asks, I'm sorry if I'm not saying your name right, or you could put a pronunciation in there, asks, can you go into more detail on what the Santeria religion is, please? What do they practice? Why do they have sacrifices?
That's a complicated question to go into now. Like that would be its own presentation. But Santeria at a large kind of quick understanding is the adaptation of enslaved Africans in the New World while they were, being forced to become Christian. And some of them, since they had their own religious background and their own, um, religious cosmos, all right? It's no different than the Greeks. If you want to associate like the gods and the way that people understand Zeus and, all the Greek deities and stuff like that, it's very similar in African religion. In particular, you have Yoruba that practice this view. There's Mandinka have some practices, although most of them became Muslim. So what these Africans did was they wanted to still continue practicing their religion. And so in the Caribbean, in the Spanish speaking countries, what they started doing was they started pairing up. Okay, so El Legua and our mythology says that he's like this, and that. And these missionaries are telling us that this saint is this, and that. Boom, we pair them together. And so, or it could be something as similar as, well, the colors for Shango are red, and Saint Barbara, who's got red on her clothing, has similar colors. Boom, so they pair them up. So that's called syncretism, and that's something that requires a lot more depth. But that's essentially what it was. And then in Brazil, you have candomblé, which is another kind of adaptation of the African communities there to maintain some of their African identity and their African cosmological views. And in Haiti with voodoo, same thing. Again, it was an adaptation to what they were experiencing. And so they were trying to keep some of their identity and some of their values and that cultural heritage with them through this, syncretized practice, or these syncretized practices.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think it was pretty comprehensive for no notice on that question. Great. Erica Santella is very engaged. There's a lot to digest with all of this. I've been on many cemetery tours and plants have never been mentioned. Do you see this becoming more common research?
It's funny that you asked that question, because one of the things that I noticed, and actually something that I did as part of this research, is that I started looking at the state of Florida's what's called the Florida Master Site File. So the Florida Master Site File is basically like a large state collection of important historic sites everywhere. So it could be a historic building, like Woodlawn, a historic cemetery, could be Indian burial grounds, whatever. Any archaeological site would be in the Master Site File. Anything of cultural significance, and I'm using that loosely because it's biased to some extent. A lot of what's culturally meaningful does lean more towards Eurocentric, norms and values. So, but the Florida Master Site File has records of, if somebody goes in and does research somewhere, then you can request, hey, I would like the Master Site File for this place. And in some cases, like for Woodlawn, you get a 60, 70 page report. In the instance of Westview Cemetery in Pompano Beach, which is another African-American cemetery, you might find a 10-page report. And within the forms that are filled out there is a little line or a couple of lines that says historic plants, or historic plants. And that's all it says, historic plants. And are there any historic plants? So you'll see like, oh yeah, sausage fruit tree, cypress, some of the more thorough, like when you're looking at tree islands, you see like, oh, it's a oak hardwood hammock, and there's a lot more descriptive or a lot more detail. In several cases, they're left blank. And I think part of that has to do with, archaeology is a social science, and it borrows a lot from other disciplines. And so what we see, and what I'm kind of seeing, is this project is just a marriage of my love. I love trees, and I like knowing what they are and knowing what they mean. And then it's also archaeology, and we're bringing in this archaeological perspective and this botanical or botany point of view, and we're bringing them together. And now it's going to deepen the our understanding of some of these landscapes. Maybe we'll have a whole field of, botanical archaeologists that get hired out to go and identify plants. I don't know what's going to happen, but right now, part of this project is for me to kind of go out there and say, hey, this is something else we need to look at. And the literature shows that there, up until now, it's been a belief of, well, this is what we think happens. And so we believe that this happens because somebody kind of shared that it happens, but no one's kind of documented it. So with the Bellamy family telling us that was our father's tree, and then showing us directly in person, like, here's our father's tree, and then saying it's been a family tradition, we have that connection now. It's documented. And so it's going to add, it might take decades, it might be something that won't be revisited for 100 years, because science is crazy that way sometimes. But I hope that it's something that will be kind of investigated more thoroughly, especially when it comes to cemeteries or cultural sites, because the trees are something that are easily overlooked. My own experience, I took the Flora of South Florida class, and I started learning about the details, like all the vocabulary for botany. So you have, the margins and the leaflets versus a leaf and all of those kind of details. And I'm driving to school one day and I'm looking, I'm like, oh, that's a gumbo lumbo tree. Oh, that's a cocoa plum. And so they stopped being just this massive green stuff that's, oh, it's just a bunch of trees. And now they started having their own identity. And so in different environments, like, oh, I know what that is. And I know what that is. Oh, that's a sable palmetto. And that's a, royal palm versus, so just being able to have the insights and to see them, I think gives us a new kind of perspective. And that's part of what I think should be, hopefully that's where we'll go. Like, that's a direction that things will move to, but I think it's going to take time.
So you have a full tree inventory and plant inventory of this cemetery now, right?
I'm developing it. Yes. I'm still going through photographs and like what species. The one that's been giving me the most trouble are the ficus. The palms, there's only a couple of palms, and sable palmetto is characteristic. So I'm like, okay, I know that's a sable, but is it a royal palm or is it a queen palm, and nuances like that. So it's identifying species, and I am looking for experts. So if somebody really knows ficus or palms, and you want to mentor me a little bit, I wouldn't mind learning and getting new insights. But
would you like me to put your email address in the chat?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. What email would you like me to use?
historybroward@gmail.com.
Okay. So any ficus experts, non-native plant experts, please contact Roberto.
Thank you. So, yeah.
So do you think you might provide this spatial tree data to people who would be able to provide cemetery tours, or maybe the city of Fort Lauderdale?
My plan is, when I'm done with the full report, to provide this to the city of Fort Lauderdale. What I would really like to be able to do is present the data and the research, and maybe do a cemetery tour myself for, more for like the maintenance staff and the people who are on the ground, that are the ones that are out there maintaining it. I have no problem presenting this to anybody that's interested, but I just think from a practical standpoint, if that's a ficus, or that's, hey, that's a whisk fern and it's not a weed, and that's really native and just a really cool plant in and of itself. If people have that appreciation, I think it'll make how they maintain this cemetery and other sites, throughout the city, like, hey, I know what this is, or I have some idea, maybe spark some interest for them as well, to see the stories. Hey, this might have more meaning, and not just to run over a croton because it's kind of gnarly looking and looks out of place. So, but yeah, the full report will go to the city of Fort Lauderdale, and I do have a permit for for a full year. So my plan is to go, once I kind of finish the data here with Woodlawn, I'm going to go and do a similar survey with with evergreen and just kind of see if there's, do some comparisons there. And then if I can extend, then I'll keep kind of going throughout the city of Fort Lauderdale and then move to another city.
Great. Erica would also like to know, are you going to write a publication on your work for the layperson? I know many people who would be interested.
So I could probably, at the moment, I want to publish for archaeologists. So one of the journals that I'm looking to publish in would be the Florida Anthropologist. But I'm not sure how detailed, what's it called? Not sure like what level of detail would be, I could probably do something simple or something, and I could share the article with the Native Plant Society. Here's the full one. I can make a simpler one with just a plant list,
Yeah.
For was the palmetto. So,
yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I can't speak for Marjorie, she's the editor, but I'm sure that would be of interest. It would be very willing to pitch that to her. Deja Johnson asks, Deja, okay, who decides the symbols and the meaning of the plants?
The groups themselves. So each culture has their own values and has their own morals and has their own mythology, and so they attribute the symbols based on their values. That actually you can almost make it out in this PowerPoint here. So on the stone, you actually have a laurel leaf kind of peeking out there on that stone. And so, the laurel leaf is one of those like for victory, like you rest on your laurels after, success. So it's just dependent on, popular culture, what's important to the people of a particular time period, what's important to the different ethnic groups, what does the mythology say? So all of those things kind of factor into who makes the determination of a symbol.
Cynthia Hirsch asks, is there any of Potter's Field left after I-95 was built? And if so, is it preserved or has it been developed?
We don't know. Like, we suspect, and again, the ground penetrating radar kind of showed that there were disturbances between the fence line for the cemetery and the asphalt for I-95. So the Potter's Field extended into about the dividing line between northbound and southbound traffic on I-95. So there is the possibility that some of the remains of people from the Potter's Field are under I-95. But I don't think anybody really has the desire to rip up asphalt to find out. But the finding of that bone back in April by the archaeologist kind of confirms the story that the community has said. Like, there were people there, and it extended there, and in some cases they said extended further than what I'm saying. But we they were not reinterred or removed or anything like that. And interviews with people who did the construction of I-95 said they didn't remember human remains being there when they were building 95. So this would have been in the early 70s. So.
Great, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Early in the presentation, you mentioned the tree from Madagascar. It's a common houseplant. Considering Madagascar is on the eastern side of the African continent, how did it get to the States? Is there a trail across Africa?
So going back to kind of what I said, that it was a popular landscaping plant in like the 50s and the 60s, it's possible that somebody may have heard it's an African plant. Not so, it's from Madagascar. We don't know. So it could be something where it has that much meaning, or it could be something as simple as, it's just a pretty plant, I just want to put it there. There's no connection at all. But, we have to take kind of all these imaginative ideas and see like, okay, does something stick? Or even, we find this plant here, and then I do go to, 15 other cemeteries in Florida, and I find, okay, they're popular here. Okay. Again, it was a fad plant in the 50s, so could that explain why? Without having somebody tell us precisely why it's here, but Um, with that plant from Madagascar, it's definitely one of those where it's like, okay, it's cool, but I don't know. I can't say definitively, like, this is how I got here. This is the story. I was thankful that a friend of mine told me, like, oh yeah, those were popular with the mid-century modern architecture and stuff. I'm like, what? So that was by happenstance.
Yeah, still a very common houseplant in Central and South Florida. I mean, houseplant indoors and then also houseplant,
Right.
used in landscapes. And I mean, we could have a whole discussion on how non-native plants get here into our nursery industry. And that would be a very interesting
Right.
topic. Go common plant by common plant. Where is it from? How did it get here? Uh, where is it planted? Is it escaped? That would be really cool. Speaking of that, Allison Bishop is inquiring about your iNaturalist username.
My
iNaturalist
uh-huh.
username?
Might be History Broward. I'm not sure.
Let me look
But
it up.
most of my Twitter handle, Instagram, a lot of my social media stuff would be either like at History Broward, just as it's spelled in the email. So if I do have it, it's there. If not, it's Roberto Fernandez the third.
It's not history. It's not history Broward.
Okay, so just email me and I will get you that info.
It's Roberto Fernandez the third. Roberto. And I'll pop the link in case people want to follow you. I'm gonna follow you. I just followed you. Okay, and there's his link. Deja also asks, what are some ways in which African culture are people buried? How do these practices differ from those found in African American burials?
So the mortuary practices differ. I have not looked into those as much. You have, regular burial, at least regular as we understand it in 2020, where somebody's put into a coffin and buried 6 feet under. Some of the practices are for people to be kind of balled up in like a fetal position and buried in that way. Um, African tradition has heads face, the top of the head would face west instead of east. So, all of those different factors, and that's really something that we can't investigate in this kind of context, because I don't think anyone wants their family member to be dug up so scientists can do some work. And it's unethical, and there's ethical issues there. So a lot of the mortuary practices and understandings that we have of mortuary practices come from um, archaeological sites that we have to move stuff because we have no choice. For archaeologists, the best place to leave historic items is in the ground where they are in context. So that way we can study and we can understand their meaning. And so, like the African American burial ground in New York was something like the reports that the archaeologists did with that really shed a lot of light on burial practices for African Americans. They showed a lot, like they did a lot of DNA science, and then they ended up reinterring the remains afterwards. But that was kind of motivated because a developer wanted to put up a big building. Actually, it was a GSA, the Government Service Administration for the federal government, and so they're the ones that were going to put up this big building and discovered this. And so it's like, okay, well, we can delay and we'll just do the science. And so that's what happened. But I don't know more specifics at this point. I'm more top of the ground and material culture, not so much the biological anthropology stuff.
Right. So we're hitting up against one, and I just wanted to let everyone know, in respect of everyone's time, that these are live DVR'd, basically. So as they're streamed, you can rewatch and go back. And so that's using the same link that you access this video. So if you need to go and you want to finish going through the questions and answers for the rest, there's not too many more, you're welcome to go and watch it later if you have a meeting or something. Sapphire Hall asks, this goes to William's question, but what parts of Africa have the most footprint in this cemetery? and also in the cemeteries around Broward in general. So if you do have any sort of general feeling for what parts of Africa,
It's hard to tell. Like we know West Africa, and it depends on years. And because of so much migration that happened after emancipation in the 1860s and just migration and movement, it's hard to like say like it's this tribe or it's people from what is today Gambia or what is today this. Like we can't tell that information. I wish we could. Aside from a DNA test, that's really hard to discern based on just, you know, non-invasive methods of doing archaeology.
Bonnie suggests that you place some sort of historical identification markers on trees and other features of historical interest.
That's actually something that I would like to do. I did many years ago. I purchased tree tags, like those aluminum tree tags and the aluminum nails. And then somebody said, well, if you put that in there, then it opens up, you know, makes the tree vulnerable. And the last thing I would want to do is put a nail into the Bellamy ficus and then I kill it. So I'm still trying to figure out how to do that. And again, I would need the blessing of the city of Fort Lauderdale before I did that. But that's something that I would like to do, even making a brochure that kind of contextualizes a lot of the stories that my students have done and the research that I've done that allows people like, hey, here's a quick history of Woodlawn. And so they can just kind of go to this and, you know, learn the story.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of members who work for botanical gardens or go to botanical gardens, and so, you know, there might be some, after you create a relationship with the city of Fort Lauderdale, you may be able to, you know, put up some very tasteful plant tags.
Yeah, I think that'd be cool.
So Allison was bringing up iNaturalist because she was suggesting that you know, post your plant photos of the ficus on there for other people to help you identify.
Oh, yeah. I just got into iNaturalist later in the summer, so that's part of why, like, I don't know all my ideas and stuff like that. I did explore one Pineland in North Broward, so I think it's just one of those, like, my ego's like, no, I want to know what it is. I don't want to cheat, but I should just go in and use iNaturalist at the cemetery and see what comes up. I worry about the what's it called, the accuracy.
Well, you don't have to use its computer vision. Like, for example, I'm subscribed to all observations that happen within Osceola County. So every time someone observes anything in Osceola County, I get an email, and if I can identify it, I go and help. So if you're taking a photo of a ficus, and maybe even you're not sure it's a genus ficus, you want to put it up to family or just flowering plants, and then wait for someone who knows what they're talking about, and then you will have no reliance on their computer vision accuracy for your plant ID.
Okay, cool. I think I'll try that.
And, yeah, and Allison is suggesting it also, you know, automatically documents the location for other people to find it.
Right.
You know, you don't have to wait for City of Fort Lauderdale to publish your data in some sort of format that people can look at.
Okay.
Yeah, Bonnie is also suggesting that you have a little informational kiosk. Should require some coordination with the city.
Yeah, the Florida Department of Transportation had a state marker put into the cemetery 2 years ago. And with that bone that was recovered back in April, they're going to put a new kind of interpretive sign into the cemetery that talks about the Potter's Field. But I think my biggest hurdle is, you know, funding. Like, I rely on grants to do a lot of the research and to take students out and stuff like that. So the students don't have to pay to do this. And so that's part of it. Like, I would love to do the interpretive signs, and that's something I could easily, like, write up. It's just, okay, finding the best thing to put into the cemetery so it'll last. But yeah, that's part of it too. But then sometimes, like, you get over cluttered with too many interpretive signs, and I don't want to take away from the aesthetic of the landscape either. So something to think about. I appreciate that.
And that's appears to be the end of the question. We're getting a lot of kudos. Richard says, "Thank you, Roberto and Valerie, for providing this chat and bringing attention to the cemetery." Sorry, sorry, I'm getting over being sick. And larger cultural connections with some historical plants. So,
well, thank you for attending and for your feedback. I mean, we're one village, we're one community, so it's what is it? Teamwork makes the dream work. So, thank you.
That's right. Yeah. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise in this project with us, and for doing this work that obviously isn't being done very often.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
And thank you everyone for being a member of the Florida Native Plant Society. And just a FYI, a heads up, our website is going to be down this weekend as we transition to our updated website. So if you're looking for a plant and you can't find it, don't panic, try again on Monday. And I won't have access to my email, so if you have any questions, I will get to them on Monday. I guess if you have my phone number, you can text me or call me. So please join us next week for our Lunch and Learn with Erin Largo White, and everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you.